So we're going to talk about loops. And a loop is a structure in code, sort of like our conditional statements that control the flow of the code or what the code does. And specifically, loops are used mostly to repeat an action more than once or a part of your code more than once. So that's the kind of main thing that you have to remember with a loop is if you want to repeat something, you use a loop. So we'll talk about the syntax a little bit, and then we'll show some examples. So different languages have different versions of loops, but all languages have some version of a loop. And if you've ever been working on one of your sketches and thought, like, I wish there was an easy way to make, like, 100 circles or something like that, a loop is what would have been the answer there. So there's a few different loops that we can do with JavaScript. We're mostly just going to use the for loop because of the way it's written, but they all behave pretty much the same way with slightly different syntax. So the way that we can set up a loop, and there's a few different components to a loop, so we'll have to talk about each one. But loops in general look like other control statements. So we've seen the if statement. So we have an if and then a condition and then some code that runs if the condition is met. So we could say like if 1 equals 1. It looks like I've already done an example like this. We'll console.log 1 equals 1. So this is a control flow. We're asking for a condition, and we're running some code based on whether that condition is satisfied or not. And a loop works the same way, but it happens more than once. And so an example of this is a while loop. Let's actually open a P5 sketch for this example. And I'll just write this in regular or vanilla JavaScript. All right, so I'm going to call this loop example. And so I'm not going to write this part in P5. I'm actually just going to get rid of this for now. And so I'll say if 1 equals 1, then well, let me increase the size a little bit. Okay, so if 1 equals 1, let's do a document.write 1 equals 1. Don't worry about that part. It's just going to write out. Oh, we can't see it because of the styling. So let's change the background. Or I guess we can change the text color. That's fine. Okay. Sketch.js. Okay. So if 1 equals 1, document.write 1 equals 1, and so we get the result over here, 1 equals 1. So that only happens once, obviously. If we wanted to compare a bunch of different numbers or do this a bunch of times, we'd need another way to do it. So I could just like copy and paste this code over and over again, but that wouldn't be very efficient. And you've probably noticed that a lot of stuff that we do in code is done as shortcuts to make things more efficient. And so a type of loop that we could use to replace this is a while loop. So in this case, let's start again. So let's say I have a variable I equals 1. And I can say if I equals 1, document.write 1 equals 1. Okay, so that's going to work because obviously 1 is equal to 1. And let's just print out I. It's kind of hard to, it's pretty small. Let's make the font size bigger too. Okay, so there's 1. So the way that a while loop changes is that instead of saying if I equals 1, we just change this if to a while. But then we have to be careful because while is going to happen for as long as this value is true. And so if I ran this code as is, our browser would just crash because it would never stop. And so I have to create a condition under which the while loop stops. And so it's easy to do that. I can just change I. So I'll say I equals 2. And so now I just get 1. That's not very useful, right? Because, we're not changing anything. So instead of saying I equals 1, let's make a separate condition so we can count with I. So what I can say is as long as I is less than, let's say 10, then I'm going to say I plus plus. So while I is less than 10, I'm going to write I, and then I'm going to count up by 1. And then this is where the loop part comes in. Because it's a while instead of an if, we loop back to the beginning. So once I finish this line, I loop up to here, and I start over again. So we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So all of the code that I write in here is going to happen multiple times. Let's say I wanted to put a space in there. I could say document.write, and I could put a line break. I guess it thinks that's a space. Maybe I need a return. Oh, it's HTML, so it's not even going to care what that is. Let's put an HTML break in there. There we go. So however much code I put in here is going to run every time we go back through the while loop. And if I change the increment condition, it'll go, it'll change how fast it goes. So if I say I plus equals 2, now we're going to skip over the even numbers. So the main thing that's different is that when we say while, we always loop back to the beginning, we reevaluate this condition, and then we do all the code that's inside here. So each time we evaluate if this is true. So let's see, document.write, I is less than 10. Okay, let's put it after. So let's write I and then less than 10, question mark. Okay, so 1 is less than 10. Obviously, that's true. 3 is less than 10. 5 is less than 10. 7 is less than 10. All of these are less than 10. At a certain point, I is going to be greater than 10, right? And so then we're going to stop our while loop. Again, with the while loop and with loops in general, if I don't have a condition for when the loop stops, I'm going to overload the browser. I'm going to get what's called a stack overflow. All right, so let's go back to I++. And what we're going to do now is put this into a for loop. Yeah, any questions so far? Okay. So while loops are fine. They work exactly the same as any other loop. But one thing that it's easier with a while loop, like if I just forgot to write this I++ here, I would get a Stack Overflow. I'd have to restart my browser, maybe even my computer. So another type of loop that we can use is a for loop, which combines all the conditions into one place. So you're a bit less likely to forget to add a condition. There's some cases where a while loop is necessary, but for what we're doing with P5, it's more likely that we'll want to use a for loop. So we need to combine these conditions into one place. So there's 3 conditions that we have. One is the initial condition. So this is where we start counting. So we start counting at 1. The other condition is right here. This is the conditional or ending condition. And this one is like, you always have to think about it in the opposite sense. Like as long as I or while I is less than 10, we're going to keep going. So as soon as that's not true anymore, then the loop stops. So that statement tells us what our condition is or when we're going to end. And then down here, we have the update or increment or iterate condition, whatever you want to call it. So that's the thing that changes the number we're using to count so that we eventually reach the ending condition. And the reason we're using I here is just programming. It's just kind of a default in programming. It comes from an old programming language where it was like one of the last variables that was available on the keyboard, so they just use I. But you could also say it stands for index. Index is, means like where you are in the count of something. So either way, you can think of it either way. And it doesn't have to be I. It can be any other variable, name or letter or whatever you want. But generally, when you see a loop, you'll see I. Okay, so to make our for loop, we just start with for. And it looks exactly like an if statement. It has parentheses for the conditions, and then it has curly brackets for the code block. Okay, not really sure what happened, but let's keep going. So I have a for loop. I have parentheses for my 3 conditions, and they just go one after the other. And then I have curly brackets for the code block that I want to run in my loop. So the first condition is my initial condition here. So I'm going to copy that and paste it here. Whoops. Make sure I'm inside the parentheses. So that's my starting condition. It's where I start counting. Variable I equals 1. So then I have my ending condition goes next. So I'm going to take that I is less than 10 and paste it. And then I have to put a semicolon after this one. So I have to separate the first 2 with semicolon. The last one I don't. And then my final increment condition goes here at the end. And this is what most for loops look like. You'll see tons of for loops that look like this if you ever look up code on the internet. And so if I put this same code in here, it's going to look exactly the same. So if I say document.write I, we get the whole thing again. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And so the reason I'm printing I is to show the value of I as it changes. It counts up from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 to 8. Let's get rid of this for now. But you don't actually have to show that value. I can write whatever I want. If I want to write hello, it'll just do hello 10 times. Or if I want to write hello and put a little break in there, it'll do that 10 times. So you don't actually have to use I in the output, but I was just showing that to show that's how many times it's counting. All right, so using a for loop, I can repeat any amount of code I want to as many times as I want to. Okay, so let's go back to I for a second. So I can also change I can change all 3 of these conditions. Whoops. Okay. So that's our for loop. This is actually a good time to introduce let. So let's do that. Okay. I'll do that in a second. So I can start counting at a different number. Like I could start I equals 5. So then we'll just count from 5 to 9. If we want 10 to be the last number, we can use less than or equal to, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be less than. So let's leave this one here so we can count to 10. We can make another one. So I could start with I equals 10, and I could count until I get to 0. So I could say as long as I is greater than 0, I minus minus. So I don't have to count up. I can also count down. So let's say document.write I, and let's put a little break in between. So now we start at 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So I can also do like if I wanted to count up by 10, I could say for variable I equals 1, I is less than or equal to 100, I plus plus, or I plus equals 10. Although this will count by 11s because it'll start at 1 and then go to 11. So let's start at 0. And we can say document.write I, and then let's put a little comma after this. And let's put a break. Okay, so we start at 0, and we add 10 each time, and we keep going, so we keep looping back to the beginning, and each time we check, is I still less than 100, and if it is, we keep going. And so we get up to 100, and then we stop because I is not less than 100. So yeah, we can start wherever we want, we can go backwards, we can go in different increments. The one thing that you have to be careful about is that the condition matches the increment. So if you're counting up, you need to have a value that's higher than where you started. If you're counting down, you need to have a value that's lower than where you started. Otherwise, you're going to get an error on the computer. All right, so let's actually draw some stuff. Oh, the last thing is using let. Okay, so for variables all semester, we've been using variable I, and that's great. It works fine. You can pretty much use it most of the time. There are some cases where you might not want to use I. The difference is that when I use var, this I exists everywhere. If I use let, the I only exists inside of the for loop. So I'll do a couple examples. So I'll use different variables. So for this one, if I say variable j equals 10, j is less than 0, or j is greater than 0, j minus minus, write j. Okay, so this will work the same. Let's put a little j here. Okay, and then down here, I'll do k. Oops. Variable k equals 0, k is less than 100, k plus equals 10, and then do k space k. Okay. So if I have var, after I finish my for loop, if I say console dot, or let's say document dot write, let's say I want to do it one more time, and I want to write j, it's going to do it fine. It's right here. So, wait, is it right there? Now I'm kind of confused. I have too much stuff going on here. Okay, let's just console log it. So I can say console dot log j. So now we should see j in the console, and there it is, it's 0. Oh yeah, because it was a 1 and then a 0. So there's j, so that makes sense, right? We started j at 10, we counted all the way down to 0, and then we stopped our loop. So j is 0 down here. Okay, if I use let, so if I say let k equals 0, and then I say console.log k down here, I get this error, k is not defined. So when I use let, I'm essentially saying k only exists inside of these brackets. Okay, so there's a slight advantage to that, which is like if you have lots of different variables and lots of different loops, if you are using let instead of var, you'll get errors if you reuse a variable or if you use a variable in the wrong place or something like that. If you use var, you may have an issue that you never see because you're never going to get this k is not defined error. So using let has that slight advantage. Other than that, they're exactly the same. And let is kind of new. It's only like maybe like 5 years old or something like that. So usually when I write a for loop, I'll use let, but var is also totally acceptable. So let's take this out, and there we go. Okay, so let's actually draw some stuff. So I'm just going to call this loops JS examples. And I'm going to make a new sketch. And I'll call this drawing with loops. And let's put a little comment here. Drawing with loops examples. March 28th. Okay. So if we want to actually use our loops to draw something, we can use it to repeat stuff. And we can use it to do a lot of different things, but we'll start with just repeating some basic shapes. Okay. So if I want to draw, say I want to draw an ellipse at 0, 200, and it's 100 pixels wide. So let's say I want to make this really simple pattern where I just have I just align the middle of my canvas with circles. If I want to do this just with code, I have to copy this and paste probably 2 more times just with hard numbers. And then I have to add these numbers in my head. So that's 100, that's 200, that's 300. And I didn't even get all the way across. So I actually have to add one more. And now I have 400. Okay. So that's fine. That's not too bad. But what if I had like each circle was a complicated drawing with lots of different shapes, or like my self-portrait or something like that? Then I'd have to do a lot of math. I'd have to do a lot of work. It wouldn't be very practical. So if I want to repeat something, it makes more sense to use a loop. Especially what if I decide to change the size of the canvas? Like let's say I say that's now 600. Now I have to copy more circles. So if I want to draw my circles with a loop, I can start thinking about, well, what is the difference between each one of my circles, and how can I iterate or increment on that difference? And so if I'm looking at these numbers, I can move this one over. The size stays the same. The Y position stays the same. The only thing that changes is the X position. Okay, so if I need to do a loop, I can loop my X position. Okay, so I need an X value. So let's say I say let X equal 0. Okay, so then X works for the first circle, but not for the next one. So then I have to look at what's the difference between the two. This one's at 100, this one's at 200, this one's at 0. So it's, it's 100 away. So I would say X plus equals 100. So X goes from 0 to 100. So now I can use X again, and it stays the same. And so now I can keep doing this, but I'm not really saving myself any time. I'm actually adding more code to the sketch. But eventually, if I keep adding X in here, now what I'll see is I have the same 2 lines of code over and over again. This ellipse at X is the same as this one, same as this one, same as this one, same as this one. So if I have the exact same line of code, I can use a loop and just repeat it. And so I also have my starting condition, X equals 0. I have my changing condition, how much I change each time. The only thing I need is when to stop. So we can figure that out. So let's put our for loop around this. So we'll say for let X equals 0. And we have the ending condition, but first we need the stopping condition. So we want to keep going until we get to the other side of the canvas. So we can say X is less than or equal to 600, or I can just put width, right? Because I already know the width of the canvas, and that just changes depending on my canvas size. So then I can move this X equals 100 up here, get rid of that extra semicolon, and close that up. And now I can put my ellipse in the middle inside this code block. and I can delete all this other stuff. And it's going to look the same. And so now I can change the canvas and it'll change my drawing. So if I add more to the canvas, or if I go back to how it was, I don't have to change the code at all. And it's like basically 2 lines of code, right? I mean, this is kind of like 3 lines of code stuck into one, but it's basically 2 lines of code. And I could draw more ellipses or more rectangles or whatever. I can draw another ellipse at X and make it, smaller. So now I have like some circles. I can put a loop inside of my loop to make smaller and smaller circles if I want to. There's a lot I can start to do with this. Let's see. Okay. So yeah, we can start making some patterns. We'll do a couple simple variations, but we'll save most of that for Wednesday. So yeah, I can make some patterns. If I add a few extra circles, like maybe I can say, like this one fill black, and this one fill is white. And so maybe it's a bunch of eyeballs, or I could make this even smaller and make each one of them like self-portrait. So I could say, I could add to X here, I could say X plus 10, and copy this. And do X minus 10. Those are too close together. Let's do X plus 20. Okay, so I can add to X as well. I don't have to just use X, so I could create a little pattern. I could change the Y value here. So maybe this is like 180, 180. So I've got some eyes. And let's add a little mouth. So I could say rectangle X 220. Rectangle width is, let's say, 50. Height is 20. And border is, or round is 10. Okay, that's a little too long. And, oh, we got to do rect mode center. Okay, so now we have a pattern that we're kind of repeating. And then we can also change aspects of, where our pattern starts and ends. So right now our circles are all sitting next to each other, but if I just change the X plus value here to something like 200, now I've got more space to work with. So I can change these values as well. If I wanted my pattern to start in the middle of the canvas for some reason, I could start at 50 or 100. I can move those values around to get different orientations for the pattern. Okay, let's add a couple of variations. So we're going to do more with this on Wednesday because we're going to add some randomness, which is going to give us a lot more ability to make variations between each pattern. But we can do simple things like we know that X is changing, but we could also change other things. Like we could say let Y equals 200 up here. And then we could change Y. So you could say Y is here. This is like Y minus 20. This is like Y minus 20 again. This is like Y plus 20. And then I could add or subtract from Y. I could say Y minus equals 50. So now I get a little slant in the vertical dimension. So I can add other values in here. It doesn't just have to be the X value in my for loop. I could also add the Y. I could also have a conditional statement. So I could say like, let count equal 0. And then I could say, if count equals 0. Let's actually do this up here. So instead of filling them all white, I could say if count equals 0, fill red. Else, if count equals 1, fill blue. And then I have to say count plus plus. And then the last one didn't get a fill because I didn't put anything. So let's say else fill is green. So I can make some variations by figuring out where I am. And I don't actually really need to use a count here because I could just say like if x is greater than 200 or whatever. But that's another example. I could also just like tie x to certain values. Like for down here, I could say like the fill is x, y 255 or something like that. And so now I get some slightly different colors for the mouth. I probably want to use the map function here, but I'm being kind of lazy. But I could do something like that. Maybe if I wanted to do like a cool gradient of faces. So let's do y minus equals 20. And so then instead of doing this count thing, let's actually just say let r equal map. So we're going to map x 0 to 255, or no, x is from 0 to width, and we'll map it from 0 to 255 for r. And then we can say fill r, and let's just do green and blue. So we get a little gradient. Maybe I'll add some more blue. Oops. So that looks kind of cool. So you can manipulate those numbers to get different variations. When we add randomness, there's a lot more that you can do with that, because this right now you're still kind of tying to like moving in one direction basically, which we might not necessarily want to do. But yeah, you can add in a lot of different variations within the loop using some of the other functionality that we've learned previously. But the main thing is just getting used to the loop. So let's work on that today. I'll stop recording. And so if you are still working on the animated version of the logo / meme, you can work on that. But if you're ready to move on to the pattern, I would just start playing around with the loop and trying to make a pattern. You can worry about adding randomness later. But just think of a pattern you might want to make, whether it's like for a T-shirt or a wallpaper or some type of design or something like that, and then try to create the pattern inside of a for loop. And you don't necessarily need to worry about variations. You could just work on the design, like the shapes and composition for now. All right, I'm going to save this. I need to stop recording.